my goodness, look at, here it is, the Popemobile again. This idea that all of the people who have lined the procession route will be able to see the coffin of Pope Francis. Some numbers we just learned that 250,000 people attended the funeral inside St. Peter's Square, and there were hundreds of thousands that were able to come to St. Peter's Basilica to pay their final respects in those 3 days that he was able to lie in state. And so for all the people that didn't get to see him, his coffin, they will be able to, if they are here in Rome, catch a glimpse of this final procession.
It's the Holy Father just moving past the Dome of Sancta Marta there. You can see it on the right in your screens. So he bids farewell to his home for 12 years. And we should remind ourselves that Pope Francis chose not to live in the Apostolic Palace. He chose to live in the guest house of the Vatican. He used to go down and serve himself from the refectory. It was quite extraordinary.
The first time I met him in 2001, while he was still the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, he was here for a Vatican meeting that he was presiding over. And I went to the Santa Marta to interview him. And of course, as you know, inside the Santa Marta, there are plenty of attendants that if a cardinal archbishop wants a cup of coffee, someone will bring it to him. But nevertheless, he insisted on going to the kitchen himself and getting us both glasses of tea because he simply wouldn't allow himself to be served.
And is that located, Monsignor, in the Jesuit tradition of the vow of poverty, or is it just a humility that's located in, well, I guess St. Ignatius was locating it in Christ as well, but is...
I would say so, John, yes. I mean, there is a real sense amongst the Jesuits that they do not seek power. In fact, Jesuits, correct me if I'm wrong, John, they cannot be bishops per se. They have to ask their superior.
They have to ask for special permission to become a bishop, that's right.
And that superior will only give it if he discerns that that particular man has a particular charism. Thank God that his superiors did in the case of Pope Francis.
And as we take a look at this, a note that Pope Francis will not be the first pope to be buried outside of the Vatican. There have been other popes, although most of them are buried in the Vatican. But this hasn't been done in over 100 years. And so this procession is unique to bring the 88-year-old pontiff's body to the Basilica of St. Mary Major, which is the oldest and largest Marian church, where the Holy Father liked to pray. And if you take a look at this 3-mile route, you can see it will cross the Tiber River near the Colosseum before reaching its final stop. And you can see a number of the large crowds that are there along this procession route.
And as John was talking about earlier, this is a route through the people of Rome, for the Bishop of Rome, by the monuments of Rome, the Colosseum. It's touching all the different parts of his character.
That's right. And you know, the late Cardinal Francis George of Chicago once famously said that in the Catholic Church, everything has happened at least once. So we have seen something like this before. In 1958, when Pope Pius XII died, he actually died at Castel Gandolfo, which is the Pope's traditional summer residence outside of town. And so there was his body was placed on an elevated platform on a truck, and then it was processed through the streets of Rome to be brought back to the Vatican for burial. But what's different in this case is, of course, the Popemobile, which is the modern symbol of papal mobility and accessibility, developed under John Paul II. And then, of course, as the Monsignor was saying earlier, the main innovation of Pope Francis is that he got rid of the windows because he wanted it to be as accessible to people as humanly possible. I often think, as a journalist covering these things, I am stunned sometimes about how thin the security membrane around popes is as opposed to other world leaders, how they allow themselves to be on rope lines in a way that, say, a president of the United States or a prime minister of the UK never would. They allow people to run up and give them hugs. Pope Francis would take cups of mate, the traditional tea of Argentina, from people in the crowd. And of course, there's an answer as to why they do that. It's not that they're being irresponsible. It's just that they believe that their fate is ultimately not in the hands of their security detail. Their fate is in the hands of a higher power.
I want to bring in Delia Gallagher, who is also with us as we watch this procession. Delia?
Well, I'm just very touched to see the Pope's coffin going through the streets of Rome, because as a Roman resident, I'm married to an Italian, and I know the relationship of Romans with their Pope. Romans can be cynical and so on, but they have a wonderful love for the Pope. And, Francis returned that love, aside from the fact that he is the Bishop of Rome. But he went out, as we know, to the jails. He went out to the orphanages. He went out to a lot of the parishes in Rome. I mean, he met the people of Rome. We talk about his international trips, but when he was here, he was always going out to a lot of the areas of Rome that would be considered peripheries. And in fact, we will see when he arrives at St. Mary Major's, many of those people, friends, really friends, because they came and visited him as well here at the Vatican. Many of the underprivileged, many of the poor that are going to be there at St. Mary Major's at the doors because of that relationship that Francis developed with them here in Rome.
Oh, Delia, it's such a good point. And as we see this open-air Popemobile, Pope Francis joked, "I cannot greet people from inside a sardine can, even if it is made of glass." And so he had that wonderful sense of humor. And Delia brings up the group of people that will be there to say their final respects to the Holy Father at St. Mary Major. They are brought by a charity, and among those are prisoners with special permission, victims of sex trafficking, transgender people, the homeless, migrants.
And I would just go back to, the church. Pope Francis wanted the church to be the great yes, not the always no. And just to open the doors and give people hope. I think he was really on the side of those who felt they didn't have any power. And Pope Francis just wanted to make their lives a little bit more hopeful, a little bit better. And he never missed that opportunity. It's quite amazing. Even when he came out of the hospital just a couple of weeks ago, he stopped along the way to greet people. Mm-hmm. It was quite amazing. He wanted to reach every heart.
I grew up Catholic, of course, and there have been times in the Catholic Church, I think many Catholics would say, they felt like the church was judging them, was judging those who were divorced, was judging those who may be gay or queer or transgender. Famously, Pope Francis said, when asked about this on this trip, "Who am I to judge?" And that really swung open the door, I think, for many people to say, oh, maybe he has something I want to listen to. And maybe there's something more I can learn.
That was very much at the heart of the Pope Francis approach, and we probably got to say that was not entirely uncontroversial. I mean, in answer to the question,
it would kind of ricochet actually around the world, I think.
In response to the question, "Who am I to judge?" there are a lot of Catholics who would say, "You're the gosh darn Pope."
Yeah.
They want a Pope to judge. They expect a Pope to judge. And there was concern in many quarters throughout these 12 years that perhaps standards were being lowered, doctrines were being fudged. And I think there was a sense in some quarters that Pope Francis was perhaps too much of a change agent. But at the end of the day, I think what you were seeing on this route as you see the Popemobile make its way through the streets of Rome, what you saw on the square today, what you will see at St. Mary Major when the Pope gets there, is that outreach, that sense that everybody has their place in the church, that resonated at a kind of deep level that gets below issues and penetrates to the heart.
And it's the way in which the symbolism of the day represents this tension between the traditions and the ancient nature of the Catholic Church, which is bedrock of the faith for some people, and yet its flexibility in the modern world, which invites new people, as you say. And here you see Francis doing symbolically what he tried to do with the church, steeped in its traditions, but adding maybe new ones just at the margin.
And there was one document, Amoris Laetitiae, which was particularly controversial. It was about giving communion to the divorced and remarried. And so often I think Pope Francis was misunderstood. He was the great misunderstood Pope in many ways. At the end of the day, he was just a good parish priest. And he simply wanted the priest to make that discernment because he knew his people. And I think that goes back to him wanting to be the Bishop of Rome. He didn't want to be the supreme pontiff. He wanted every bishop, he wanted every parish priest to deal with his flock because they knew them best. And that's exactly what happened with that document. It was the same with the blessing of gay couples. In fact, Pope Francis said every individual can be blessed. I'm not blessing the actual union,
yes,
but I'm blessing the person because that person is loved by God.
And those are good cases in which what changed was the tonality rather than the lyrics. Because if you think about it, when it comes to communion for the divorced and remarried, Pope Francis did not rewrite Catholic teaching on marriage. It remains the case. The Catholic Church teaches that a marriage is a union between a man and a woman that is for life. And when it comes to the blessing of persons in same-sex unions, it's not that he said all of a sudden that we are going to begin celebrating gay marriages, but we are going to celebrate people, even if those people are living in ways that are not fully in accord with the Catholic Church's own particular moral vision. And I think that was the pastoral revolution, in a way, that was the heart of the Francis message, to emphasize people first, politics second.
Yeah, the aspect of unconditional love, no doubt. And as we look at these incredible crowds, just take a look at this. As the Popemobile and that procession goes through the streets of Rome, the people paying their final tribute to the Bishop of Rome. And it was just about a year ago that we sat down with Pope Francis, and I asked him about all of these issues that we are talking about. And I did also ask him what he wanted his legacy to be. Let's listen. What do you hope your legacy is?
I never really thought about it. The church is the legacy. The church not only through the Pope, but through you, through every Christian, through everyone. Personally, I get on the bandwagon of the church and its legacy for all.
You mean that the church is for everybody?
Yes, for everybody, and in particular for the privileged. Do you know who are the privileged in the church? The sinners. We, the sinners, are the privileged ones, because Jesus came to call upon us sinners, all of us.
The
Lord forgives everything, everything. It is we who get tired of asking for forgiveness.
He was remarkable in that way, you know, always directing it outward and inviting people back in by saying we're all sinners.
In one of his
the privileged.
Yes.
I mean, that really turns it upside down.
Yeah, in one of his very first interviews to Antonio Spadaro, he's the head of a Jesuit journal, and Antonio asked the Pope, who is Jorge Maria Bergoglio? And the Pope pondered for a moment, and he answered, a sinner. A sinner. He said, I am astute, I can adapt well, but deep down I know myself to be a sinner. And he reminded us of his motto as a bishop, which he continued as Pope, which was this: He, God, looked at me and showed mercy and then chose me. And I think he had that hope in every single person. Mercy, we look at people, we show mercy, and then we can be chosen whoever we are.
Right. That's a universal message, not he chose me as Pope. He chose to love me as a child of God. You know.
One of the things, oh my goodness, look at these crowds.
Huge.
Oh, it's just incredible to see everyone with their phone up in the air to record this historic moment as the Bishop of Rome is brought through the
This is the main square of Rome, Piazza Venezia, which is being dug up, actually. It's the great year of the Jubilee, so there's a metro line going through here. So it's difficult to get to, but look at those crowds. They're amazing. And he's now going to ride down to the Colosseum. Sorry, John.
No, just in classic Roman fashion, we are coming up on being halfway through the Jubilee year, and of course that work project is still not done, which is par for the course. But it is so amazing to see the scene that we are watching play out in front of us, in part because one last time, I mean, typically at a papal funeral, if you want to be part of that experience, you have to come to the Vatican. But once again, you see Pope Francis coming to where people are. There is something poetically absolutely apt about the fact that even in his final act, he is exiting the Vatican to go to where people are.
People are shouting, "Grazie," Pope Francis, as his coffin is driven through Rome. And I want to go now to Seth Doane, who is at the Basilica of St. Mary Major. And Seth, describe the scene there.
More and more people have been coming, of course, watching on these giant screens the entire service, applauding, along with what we could hear from the folks at St. Peter's Basilica. But as John says, it is quite fitting that Pope Francis in the end would be leaving the dignitaries behind and coming here with the people. This basilica is in the heart of an area called Esquiline, the Esquiline Hill. It is a multicultural, popular place. It is known for its diversity, and there's certainly diversity in the crowd, diversity of faithful who have come. We've spoken with a number of non-Catholics. I spoke with a guy recently from Idaho who was part of the Mormon church, and he said he came to honor a man of God. That's why he was lining this route. Also, those 40 or so people who have come from various backgrounds, all having met the Pope, met representatives of the trans community, homeless, prisoners, all people who have been in some way touched by Pope Francis. And we've heard so much of that. Just the other day, we went to a special service down in the Trastevere area of Rome to talk with a Syrian refugee who credits his entire new life in Italy to the humanitarian quarters and to the support of a group called the Community of St. Egidio, which was also supported by Pope Francis. We spoke with a paramedic, a former lawyer from Bakersfield who traced his roots, moved to Italy and said, I've become more Catholic since I'm living in Italy. I've become a greater supporter of Pope Francis, in part because of how he supports groups like the Red Cross, how he supports issues like migrants and refugees. So we're hearing of this real multiculturalism and support across so many different usual barriers and boundaries. He brought people together.
Seth Doane outside St. Mary Major, where the Popemobile is on its way there. It's just remarkable to just see everyone lining the streets, isn't it, on this beautiful Saturday here in Rome. It's just about 1 p.m. local time following that funeral mass, with more than 250,000 people packing St. Peter's Square, along with monarchs, along with presidents and prime ministers. And some of the news is that the Pope bringing together in one of his final acts President Trump and President Zelensky for this meeting, where we're told there could even be a second meeting today. And of course, people hoping for some resolution to the war in Ukraine.
You know, what I'm struck by is living in Rome. Rome is, of course, the crossroads of the world in many ways, and Romans are very accustomed to VIPs being in town. And to be quite honest with you, and they're used to convoys moving with police escorts through the streets of the city. To be very honest with you, the President of the United States, the Secretary General of the UN, the President of the European Union could be in a motorcade moving through the streets of the city, and the average Roman wouldn't get up from their table having coffee to acknowledge it. But this is utterly different. You see the Pope's people turning out in droves to be part of this experience, and I guarantee you every one of these people will be talking about this for the rest of their lives. They will remember this moment till the day they die.
I mean, look at this by the Colosseum. What a moment.
This is quite something as well, you know, the vox populi, the voice of the people. I think that's significant for the conclave. I think the cardinals are going to look at these images and say, wow, Pope Francis did touch hearts.
I thought that during the Mass when we were listening to Cardinal Ray's homily, and every time he mentioned one of the Pope's signature issues, whether it was migration or war and peace and climate change, inclusivity, you heard that crowd erupt. And I thought they were speaking as much to the cardinals who were going to elect Pope Francis' successor as they were speaking to us.
The vox populi, yeah.
We should note also, just as a historical bit of irony, that the Christians were persecuted in the Colosseum there, as the former leader of the Catholic Church is moving people. In religion, we often talk about people being moved, and that is what we're witnessing, people being moved into the streets by their relationship with Pope Francis.
John Allen, what about that, though? I mean, even though Pope Francis has had such an influence on the selection of many of these cardinals, that does not mean they will necessarily choose someone in his image or likeness. I'm using that incorrectly. Someone like him in his sort of values. What is the church at a crossroads in terms of continuity or change?
Well, every papal election, in a way, shapes up as a referendum between continuity and change. That is, do we want to keep going with the papacy that just ended, or do we want to move in a different direction? In 2005, after the death of John Paul II, cardinals believed they had witnessed the end of a historically successful papacy and voted overwhelmingly for continuity. That's how we got to John Paul's right-hand man, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, as Pope Benedict. In 2013, the cardinals voted overwhelmingly for change. They felt that they had witnessed a troubled, in some ways failed papacy, wanted to move in a different direction. That's how they elected Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio so quickly. So, yes, of course there's a contest between continuity and change this time. And I think one of the really interesting elements of this conclave, apropos of that point, is that to me it is not as clear as it was the last two times which of those two positions, continuity or change, is going to prevail, which makes handicapping this conclave all the more complicated.
What is that old saying, after a fat pope comes?
Well, the Italians always say, you always follow a fat pope with a thin one, meaning that you don't just run off to a photocopy machine and reproduce the pope who has just died. You elect his own, a man who is his own person.
There's a similar expression in American politics with presidents, that they pick one that is different from the other.
You know, I spoke with Cardinal Czerny yesterday, and I asked him that question about, is there, what will it be, continuity or change? And he says it's both. The church is always about both.
Yeah, and
as a good Jesuit, he rejected the premise of my question. He said, I felt like I was back in Georgetown, Cardinal. But he said it's about going forward. It's about going forward.
Yes, and I think that is a key element. You know, one of the cardinals just yesterday, a German cardinal, Cardinal Gerhard Müller, was talking about that the church just shouldn't listen to the applause of the people. That we need to be faithful to doctrine. And yet I think what Pope Francis was saying is that if doctrine doesn't speak to the heart of people, if it doesn't move the hearts of people, then it serves no purpose. And so there is certainly that continuity, but at the same time, there has to be that change so that we meet the needs of the people.
And you can see the open Popemobile making its way through Rome. Let's bring in Seth Doan, who is at St. Mary Major. Seth?
Hi, Nora. We've just turned the camera so that you can see the beginning of this procession here. We can't even see the Popemobile carrying the coffin quite yet from our position, but what we did see all of a sudden was all of these cell phones rise up into the air. There is a great anticipation. People have been waiting here for hours and hours in this beautiful day, but the hot sun. And Pope Francis's final resting place at this beautiful basilica here in the heart of Rome. I used to live just down the street and would pass this basilica almost every day, going here or there. So you think of this Pope who always wanted to be with the people, who spoke of humility through his entire life, who preached humility, and then of course would want to be laid to rest in a place surrounded by people. Now if you're looking at my camera, Jack, our cameraman, is shooting the beginning of the procession, the motorcade. Earlier we saw arriving Swiss guards, members of the clergy. Now I'm just hearing more and more applause, frankly, as Francis, his motorcade, as the coffin, and now we see it here. Here is the coffin, Pope Francis.
And Seth, just describe the scene. How many people are there? What are they saying? What are they shouting?
Nora, they are applauding. There are cheers. Some are standing very quietly. Some are waving. He's just passed by our position now. Cheers. It's a oddly joyous moment. It's oddly emotional and joyous. I can't quite describe the feeling here. We've been hearing the music, we've been hearing the entire service through the day, and people have been waiting for this moment, which has just happened, where Pope Francis in his coffin has been brought here. He's being backed up. We can hear the bell chiming.